tomorrow is International Women's Day, which has become very tame and really been incorporated into establishment culture. You might have seen Rishi Sunak and his lovely billionaire wife trying to tell us, for Grazia magazine, that they have little squabbles about who makes the bed and how they love to make the table, as they said. I mean, clearly neither of them does. The housekeeper does. So we have with us Ben Lewis to remind us about the radical roots of International Women's Day and how we could perhaps reclaim this date in our diary. Within capitalism, which of course oppresses men too, women do still get a double or triple whammy. So in a future session, we also want to look at the culture of matrilineal society, for example. But for now, over to Ben Lewis and the German communist Clara Zetkin, who we both named our daughters after. Hi, Ben.
Hello everyone. Apologies to do this classic thing where you give a talk and then have to run away and not take any questions. So if you do want to contact me with any questions or anything, please just reach out, get in touch either through Tina or directly. I want to title this very brief overview of International Women's Day with Our Day. Our Day was the title of a report written by Clara Zetkin in the pages of her bi-monthly Marxist women's magazine, Die Gleichheit, Equality, on March the 29th, 1911. It was a report of the first demonstrations of International Women's Day, Working Women's Day as it was back then. And I promise that I will have this article translated tomorrow for this occasion, because it's obviously on the one hand a kind of fascinating insight into what actually happened on the day itself. The first International Working Women's Day, as I'll describe it in a second, was celebrated and commemorated in Germany, Austria and Switzerland and Denmark. Those were the four countries for the first year in 1911. But also it's quite prescient insofar as it outlines some of the issues that Tina just alluded to when it comes to the struggle for women's rights and its place within the struggle against capitalism. Here, two pictures. On the one hand, Clara Zetkin, that's her recently produced letters that I'm working on translated into English. The other comrade there is Käthe Duncker, a very important but largely overlooked figure in German communism. And they were the two main movers, motivators of a motion presented to the second International Conference of Socialist Women in Copenhagen in 1910, where it was decided, following on from other developments in the workers' movement, not least the Socialist Party of America's National Women's Day, to dedicate a single day for a demonstration, for and a celebration for women's suffrage. That was the main goal of the day itself. But obviously that was part and parcel of the outlook and approach of the International Socialist Women's Movement more generally, which, as I've written about on many occasions, was essentially a way of organizing women, workers within the framework of the Socialist Second International and the mass parties of the Second International. So you can see here the motion that was passed, and these women were that passed this motion. This was about a meeting of about 100 women in Copenhagen, the second such conference, I think, from 13 countries, including the first elected female MPs who came from Finland. There were 3 of them there at that conference. And there were pains. There were a number of controversies that kind of went through this conference at the start about the nature of suffrage and what it should be. And the opinion that won the day was that of Zetkin, Duncker, and the radicals in the movement, which said that we shouldn't be content with a kind of so-called partial suffrage, or what Zetkin once called a ladies' suffrage, i.e. a suffrage based on property rights, the existing suffrage that there was for men in Germany, for example, the 3-class suffrage based on property and tax duties. Some women in the bourgeois women's movement, for example, would have been quite content with having the vote for themselves, but not for their servants or the people they employed. And there was a controversy about that at this conference, and the radical view won out at the end of the day. what's interesting when it comes to it's got a long and kind of complex history in terms of the Women's Day. I say the first one was 1911. The Russian women celebrated their first International Women's Day, I think, in 1913 or 14. And from that was always the last Sunday of February, the equivalent of which was the 8th of March. And from that time, then that was a kind of standard day in the calendar of the socialist movement. There's obviously a long and complicated history in terms of the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc and how things developed. But it should be remembered that while in the Eastern Bloc it was kind of it was maintained as a day of celebration, at the same time it was also kind of depoliticized. And even to today in post-Soviet Russia, you'll find that women are given flowers on March the 8th, and that's been a practice for a very long time. And again, that's well, it's a nice gesture, I suppose. It's not exactly in keeping with the original premise, which was women's political organization and integration into the parties of socialism. And in the Western world, it's following World War II in particular. And in Germany, which was kind of this kind of central battlefield of the Cold War, International Women's Day for a long time was seen as a kind of event of the devil, right? As a kind of communist thing that shouldn't be touched with a barge pole. Indeed, in post-World War II Germany, only a few kind of fringe marginal communist groups actually even bothered to do something on March the 8th and invoke the radical spirit of its founders. Because of, as I said, the general balance of Cold War politics. But there's a shift, and I think it's a shift that's kind of telling in many ways in terms of the fate of the workers' movement, certainly in the West, its integration into state structures, its integration in social democracy into the bourgeois establishment. And really a kind of watershed moment in this is in the 1970s. I think it's 1974 where the United Nations actually officially designates this as a day of celebration of women. And that goes hand in hand, obviously, with a certain agenda, a certain depoliticization, and a certain dehistoricization, of course, that continues apace to this day. Tina mentioned the example of Rishi Sunak. I must admit, when it comes to International Women's Day, I tend to, well, partly because I'm asked to speak usually, so I'm quite busy, but I tend to shy away from the establishment media just because it kind of makes me feel quite ill about, to see how far things have degenerated over the course of the last 100 odd years. And I think that the point I would stress is that, from the very outset, this should be seen as and celebrated and viewed as our day. It is something that, for all the things that have gone wrong, and there are plenty of them, that things that we need to learn from, that we need to be slightly ashamed of, that we need to be to draw lessons from in the history of the socialist movement, it must be emphasized that women's rights, the expansion of women's rights, was to a large extent down to the success of this incredibly important international socialist women's movement that kind of set the pace and set the agenda of these questions at a time when things were even more difficult for women. And I always find it interesting that in the run-up to March 8th, you have a few significant days. March 5th was the birth of Rosa Luxemburg. March 6th, by the way, is the day that, certainly in Germany, they've calculated that that's the day in which, given the gender pay gap that exists at the moment, women work basically for free on average until March the 6th. So that's always a nice way of thinking about March the 8th and International Women's Day as well, and the controversies that still surround that. Like I say, tomorrow I will have a translation of the report of the first such International Women's Day held by the International Socialist Women's Movement. Here you can just see the call. This was the 6 days before the first demonstration in March 1911, and here, as I say, is the lead article, Unser Tag, our day. There's plenty more to be said about it, but I do have to rush off, so I apologize for that. But I just wanted to give you a quick kind of overview of where it came from, why it came into being, why that history has been lost, and why also, in a sense, even on the far left of kind of we may not have forgotten where International Women's Day comes from, But as I argue in my book on Clara Zetkin, which Tina can promote later on, we've also kind of lost what was unique about the international socialist women's movement, its particular agenda of always tying or marrying the question of the oppression of women to the social question more broadly, and their emphasis over and over again, and you'll see this in the article I'll translate tomorrow, that the emancipation of women must be the work of working class men and women together, and that's always something worth emphasizing. So of the 1 million people that came out for the first demonstration in March 1911 in Germany, it was men and women together, most of whom, not all of whom, were organized in German social democracy. I shall leave it there. As I say, if you have any questions, please send them over, and apologies I have to run off.
Thank you very much, Ben. If you could stop sharing your screen, yep, that'd be good. Thank you for coming along. I could speak with you for hours about that. Just one quick thing before you have to rush off, because it's also important to remember that she was not a feminist, was she, Clara Zetkin?
Yeah, that's right. So that's you will see more about that in the article, and it's also in the book. So that's one of the controversies that again, we've kind of lost our own history, and in a sense we've allowed then this history to be appropriated by establishment feminism, the usual girl boss stuff you see nowadays, and that's a problem. But I think in terms of the left and our own history, we've lost what was unique about Zetkin and her approach to women's liberation, which I go into more detail in the book, and you'll see on my website tomorrow there'll be a translation of it of that first demonstration.
I've put a very long link in the chat. I'm trying to find a shorter link to the Amazon where you can actually buy the book. But it's a good book.
And they're saying where will it be translated? It's marxismtranslated.com. I'll put it up on there tomorrow, and I'm sure we can circulate it or something.
Yes, I'll put it in the. I'll send out an email tomorrow with all the links. Thanks very much for joining us. Thank you, Ben.
Good luck. Take care.
Good luck with your other meeting.
Bye-bye.